going to spend the next little while talking about the democratization of medicine, why it's important, why we should be desperate for it, and some approaches about how to potentially get there. And I'm going to start off with a little story about what crystallized it for me. And like most things that I learn that are important, I either learned as a kid or from a kid. And in this case, it was my son. So this is Bear. And a couple years ago, we were traveling, and he befriended a handicrafts guy on the side of the street. And during our trip, he kept going back to this guy and learning how to make these little, flowers out of palms. And one day he said, Mommy, how come our friend here makes less than $1,000 a year, but you just bought a $2,000 ukulele? And I looked at my husband and I said, well, what are we going to say? We could tell him this like Ayn Randian thing about, we work harder, so we make more money and we deserve that stuff. But at the end of the day, we just said, you know what, life's unfair. And we're lucky enough to be born in a place where we can afford those things and where we can afford good education and good health care, and some aren't as lucky. And so he said to me, I get it. We're not all born equally, but we still have to treat people equally, right? And it's such a simple concept. And I had to think about it. And over the next couple months, I went to a number of tech conferences, and what I realized was that the greatest innovations of our time have always happened when we actually treat everyone equally. Innovation is not incremental, right? True innovation, revolutionary innovation, is something where it touches everyone, and it can touch everyone. And it touches the masses. And so when we look to health, we think, okay, well, what is true innovation? What are some exponential eras in health? And it turns out we are living in one right now. So this is the global life expectancy over time. And if you can see, basically in the past 100 years, we have doubled our health expectancy. This is unprecedented. And really what has enabled this are basic access to sanitation and controlling infectious diseases for the masses. So interestingly enough, longevity has not really changed. Socrates died at 71, and he was executed. People were living to their hundreds 100 years ago. But the reason that our average life expectancy has changed is because we've been bringing everyone up. So before, when someone lived to 50, that means that a kid died at 1. Now, we're all, on average, living longer. But what's happening today? Well, last year, we discovered that our actual life expectancy in the US is decreasing. And if it decreases again this year, that will be the first time in over 100 years since the Spanish flu that our life expectancy has decreased 3 years consecutively. What's going on? It turns out that 100 years ago, the scourge of the day were infectious diseases. And we've actually been very good at managing those. But today, they're chronic diseases. So our bodies are actually beautiful machines. So after we reproduce, we're kind of meant to die. And what happens is, after we reproduce, as we live older and older, we're kind of being threatened by these chronic diseases, which are diseases of the self. Cancers, heart disease, brain diseases. And today, over 50% of adults suffer from these. That's over 140 million people in the US alone. And they account for over 70% of deaths and over 80% of all health expenditures. In particular, we have to worry about the brain. It's kind of the last piece to go. And the biggest brain problem today is Alzheimer's. And it is the 6th leading cause of death in the US and is the only one of the top 10 that is rising. This is a $1 trillion global problem today. 1 in 2 of us, when we get to 85, if we're lucky enough to be 85, will have Alzheimer's. And the prognosis is not good. It's 100% fatal, and today there's no cure or treatment around. So, some of you may be thinking, well, this is a rich world problem. Is this really a global epidemic? Well, in fact, it is. This is from the WHO, and the data is a bit old, but it still should get the point. So chronic diseases have now become a poor country's problem as well, and potentially even a greater burden. 4/5 of deaths in China today are due to chronic disease. Countries like Sri Lanka, Jamaica, Egypt, as varied as those, they all show the similar pattern. And in fact, in some of the poorer countries, the burden is even higher because it's more deadly. So for instance, Brazil, probably 5 times as many people die from heart disease in Brazil as in Britain. But Brazil does not have 5 times as many populations. If you can see here, the trend is consistent. And Africa is actually the only continent right now where infectious diseases are still killing more than chronic diseases, but even that tide is shifting. Measles was the #6 killer in sub-Saharan Africa in 2010, and today it's number 33 on the list. So how is the drug development industry kind of reacting to this? Well, they're pretty smart, and they're addressing it. So this is a list of the top 10 drugs this year. And as you can see, all 10 of them are facing chronic disease. That makes sense. Another interesting thing to note is 7 out of the top 10 are biologics. So what does that mean? Well, traditional small molecules, like the pills that we take, those are small molecules. These biologics are a lot more complicated. They're also a lot more targeted and effective, but they cost a lot. So on average, over the last 20 years, the average price of a monoclonal antibody treatment is about $96,000 a year. There are other new modalities coming online, and they're fantastic, right? There's enzyme replacement therapy. This is about $500,000 to $750,000 a year for approved treatments. We have some CAR-Ts, which are doing magnificent things for cancer patients. But these are also about $500,000 a year. You have gene therapies, which are also about $500,000 a year. I mean, these cost more than people's homes, which is their largest single asset for many families. So the question is, can we afford these? Or who can afford these? And the answer is not many people. So if you just take the average price of a new monoclonal antibody, and you see across, and it turns out that most of the world's GDP, including in wealthy countries, cannot afford these treatments. Now, of course, there are individuals who can afford it, either privately or through insurance. But the takeaway is these are not accessible medicines, and they will not be accessible to most people. So what if we think about Alzheimer's? Well, let's see. What about a new Alzheimer's treatment? So this is the spread of Alzheimer's. And as you can see, the disease doesn't really discriminate, doesn't really care how much you make, because in fact, Asian countries are kind of top of the list. And so, the majority is going to be in Asia and South Asia over the next 20 years. Now, if you look at overall health expenditure, you see that, predictably, most of it is spent here in North America or in Europe. So let's just do some back-of-the-envelope calculations. We won't even take the $96,000 for the new monoclonal antibody. We'll assume that, let's say half, about $48,000 or $50,000. What will it cost for these regions to treat everyone that has Alzheimer's with these treatments? And can the system take it? It turns out that it will be pretty devastating. So in the US alone, it's about 10% of what we spend today. It obviously increases as you go, but look at Southeast Asia. I mean, there's no way that they can even cope. I mean, we're talking 600% almost on just expending for Alzheimer's as what they spend today. So what are we going to do? Well, let's look back in history and see what have we done in the past when we faced epidemics. Let's go back, let's say 70 years. Iron lungs. So 1940s, 1950s, this was the scourge of the day. This was polio, right? This is what, it's summer today, and if we were summer in 1940, basically, the trains would be shut down, the swimming pools would be shut down, no one would be going to the movie theater, no one would even be sharing waters or, being in this congregation together. And these iron lungs were the state-of-the-art technology and medical treatment for people who suffered for acute lung paralysis. The National Foundation, they would cost about $1,500 a piece, which at that time was about the price of a house. And the National Foundation was distributing these to clinics all over the country. And this was what you were going to do. If you got polio and you got super sick, you were going to get in one of these. And the treatments would be 1, 2 years, maybe 1 year. This guy, Paul, is actually in my backyard in Dallas. And he has been in one every day for the last 65 years. And this was a state-of-the-art treatment. I mean, can you imagine that this is what we wanted, or we thought was the way to address polio, until a guy named Jonas Salk came around. And he developed a vaccine. And the irony is that the virologists of that day were super skeptical and unsupportive. And Jonas Salk actually had to test the vaccine on himself and his family first to prove up the concept. And then he was able to roll it out to mass clinical trial, which turned out to be probably the biggest volunteer human experiment in history up to that point. And what was the impact? Well, that's the extraordinary thing. So within just a few years of the introduction of the vaccine and then a different version, basically the incidence of polio dropped to almost nothing. And it has stayed there. So raise your hand if you've been vaccinated. Okay, awesome. Congratulations. You are one of a special club of about 6 billion people. Vaccines are actually the most prolific and successful medicine of today. Over 80% of the world is vaccinated, and that means a lot because vaccines mean like you have to have access to a clinic, some sort of person to administer it, some cold chain supply. So the good news is that the vast majority of the world has access to some basic level of healthcare. And today, there are over 20 vaccine-preventable diseases. We are getting control over infectious diseases. And as a result, this has contributed to the exponential increase in our lifespan. So, we've done this. We've immunologically sculpted our early childhood to be able to resist these devastating infectious diseases. What if we could do that for chronic diseases? What would that look like? Is it possible? It turns out that some people already do. Remember that stat that 1 in 2 people will have Alzheimer's over 85? That also means that 1 in 2 people won't. So what's the difference? So it turns out that researchers have studied these high-performing cohorts of centenarians. And these are people who are 100 but are performing multiple standard deviations higher than their peers. And they look in their blood, and they find that these guys somehow are auto-vaccinating themselves against these agents of chronic disease, whether it's amyloid plaque for Alzheimer's, or alpha-syn for Parkinson's. Somehow, their body is naturally fighting these endogenous proteins. So how do we train everyone else to protect themselves like these high-performing centenarians? Well, there are a couple approaches, and there are different companies doing different things. So a classic approach is through monoclonal antibodies. And there's a company doing this. They're in Switzerland. And they basically looked at these high-performing 100-year-olds. They looked into their blood. They looked at the antibodies. They spun those antibodies out. They kind of optimized them, amplified them, and now they're producing globs of them in these bioreactors. And that is the drug that they're testing in the clinic and that they will be selling. So that's one approach. But that requires, because your body's not producing itself, to be getting IV infusions once a month for the rest of your life. The other approach is active vaccination, where we kind of train your body to do that itself. And we train your body to behave more like the people that are naturally resistant and naturally not getting these diseases. So it's the classic, teach a man to fish, and you can feed him for a lifetime. Or you could let him defend himself against these chronic diseases. So what is this? Is this possible? Is this next vaccine revolution possible? So I'm going to ask you to bear with me for a second. And I promise I will come back and tie this together. But this is probably the root of the revolution. And it's in boars. So there's this thing called boar taint, which I only learned about a decade ago. And what it is if anyone eats pork, you go to the supermarket, you buy pork, and it's guaranteed to be either from a female pig or a castrated male pig. And the reason is male pigs that are uncastrated have this taint and this smell that men just find extremely distasteful. Women, for some reason, actually don't tell and don't care. But as a result, every pig that is sold for meat is either female or castrated male. And so the industry came to us and said, you know what, right now we're surgically castrating them. And animal welfare groups are coming. It's like the pigs get kind of feverish and they get down and they don't convert as well. So is there a way to give them a shot and immunologically castrate them? Is that possible? And we said, well, we'll try. We're vaccinologists. Let's give it a shot. And the reason it's difficult, it's because you're basically working on a biological problem that's inside the pig. Well, we tried, and it turns out we succeeded. And if we give them a couple shots, their balls disappear. As a sidebar, this vaccine was invented by my mother. So, you hear about parents like scaring dates away. My mother actually invented a vaccine that makes males' balls disappear. So why is this so difficult? Why is this so amazing? I mean, okay, you're just making some balls disappear. Well, it turns out that there aren't that many vaccines like this. And in fact, this is one of only 4 vaccines in the entire world, animals, humans, period, that can operate against an endogenous protein. And we're actually the only ones that do it with a novel vaccine technology. Why is it so difficult? Well, humans, animals are really smart. They don't like to attack themselves. If they did, that would be autoimmune disease. So it's really difficult to get the body to respond and attack something, even though it's toxic inside, but it's produced by yourself. So, classic vaccine technologies, they either can't get people to respond or animals to respond, or they do stuff to get the whole entire immune system to respond, like rallying an army, and as a result, you get really bad side effects. So it's difficult. We proved it up in this one model, and we ended up turning it into like a whole animal health pipeline. So we've validated our technology. We have this whole suite of swine vaccines now. So we treat them we cut their balls off, we keep them safe, all the way until slaughter. And what happens is that we've commercialized over 4 billion doses. We now vaccinate about 25% of the world's pigs on an annual basis. And what's the testament to the technology is that we took over a crowded market where you couldn't compete on price, and we took over 50% of the market in 3 years. And then we thought, well, what would it take for a vaccine for Alzheimer's? And at the time, about 2 decades ago, there was another company that had tried this. And they were super smart. They brought the vaccine into clinical trials. And unfortunately, they had problems with the vaccine as an approach. And just like I was talking about before, it's either really hard to get the body to respond. And if you do, you have to do some of these tricks that basically gets every part of the body to respond. And that's what they ran into. They ran into only 50% responded. But of those, there was a lot of side effects. And about 6% of the population got meningoencephalitis. And some of them died, so they had to halt the trial. So here we were, a bunch of vaccinologists, non-neurologists, and we were like a motley crew of immunologists and biochemists, and we said, you know what? We can solve that vaccine problem. And so we tried. And so, what does it take for a good vaccine? Well, it's got to be safe, right? We got to make sure that we don't have meningoencephalitis. We got to make sure that we don't have the other safety concerns of other Alzheimer's treatments. We got to make sure that people respond. You don't just want 1 or 2 people out of your trial to respond. So we'd like to get optimally 100% to respond. And we'd like the response to be targeted. So we'd like them, once we turn the body into a drug machine, we want those drugs to be exactly where we want them to go. We want them to be attacking the right things. And we want to make sure that they engage in the brain and do something good for people. So, UB311 is the very creative name that we've given ourselves, this program. But the check marks are all the things that we've been checking off. And the bottom thing is, we're waiting to see how efficacious it is for the brain. Our phase 1 trial read out a few years ago, and basically, we saw preliminary signs of efficacy, small numbers, but we saw stabilization in 3 out of 3 cognitive tests. And today, we're in phase 2, we're wrapping up this year, and we're looking at the brain and saying, like, hey, can we take out these bad plaques in the brain? And if you ask most people, do you want this amyloid plaque? Amyloid is like a plaque associated with Alzheimer's. The resounding answer is no. So this is a classic PET image, and the red is the amyloid. And so the idea is, what if we could safely remove these plaques with a vaccine approach? That would be really cool. What if it looked like this? That would be awesome. We're not allowed to, we haven't published our data yet, but basically when we unblind and release it, this is what we're going to be looking for. And I'll just give you a hint. This is actually not Google images from the internet. These are somehow taken from somewhere else. And the idea is really so this is exciting for us because we've proven it up in animals. We're trying to prove it up in humans. And if we can do this, there's so many other things that we can go after. Anything that's chronic, anything that's cell surface that can be gotten by an antibody, we want to come in with a vaccine approach that's easier, that's safer, that's democratizable. So we're working on, actually the whole platform is being worked on for diabetes, allergies, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. And at United Neuroscience, we're focused on the diseases of the brain. So our Alzheimer's trial is in phase 2, finishing up this year. We're going to be launching a Parkinson's trial next year. We have an anti-migraine vaccine also about to launch. And so, this is what we're up for. And our vision is really, can we enable, can we start, can we generate the next vaccine revolution? There are so many benefits of vaccines. They're convenient. Forget IV infusions for the rest of your life. What if you're just going in like a flu shot, like an annual booster? They're safe. Because they're safe and they're convenient, they can be used prophylactically. It's so much better to prevent Alzheimer's in the first place than treating it when you already have it. And most importantly, at least for us, is there's this added component where it's cost effective and can thus be globally scalable. But we can't do it alone, and we recognize that. And so just like the mission to the moon wasn't done by a single entity, the mission to the moon required the galvanization of many industries, from new materials, rocket technology, robotics, computers. We're going to need help also. And thankfully, people are working on this. So we're going to need better biomarkers, better ways to detect whether you're at risk for Alzheimer's, whether you're getting close, pre-symptomatic. So right now, we're developing, or the industry is developing, new PET biomarkers. So now we can see inside the brain and say, okay, how much plaque do you got? Is that problematic? If so, let's think about this. But that's expensive, and that's hard to roll out. So we want our easier, more cost-effective biomarkers, like blood-based biomarkers, or retinal scans, or even, lots of people have watches now. What if you can put a watch on your grandmother, and that watch will know sooner than anyone whether she's got changes in her gait, whether she's got movement disorder. And that'll report back to the doctor. So these are things that will be helping us advance and helping us roll out vaccines. And the other part is what our basic treatment model is. Because on a global scale, we're not going to be able to have neurologists see everyone. So you're going to have to figure out different models of assessing, diagnosing, and administering treatments. So there are some medical kiosks that have come up. Obviously, telehealth is a new trend. We're hoping that more clinics pop up in neighborhoods. And some people even think, okay, what about drones, right? Eventually, you can think the technology is already out there. It hasn't been put together. But you can have drones come in, retinally scan you, say, okay, you haven't gotten your shot for the year, and then give you a shot. And the last thing is we need competition. We need people to keep working on these things. Everyone asks, what about your competitors? And I say, they're really our collaborators, because at the end of the day, this is a mission that no one has ever done before, and we need as many people to learn from as possible. And that's what guides these exponential impacts. So let me just go back to where I started from, back to the wisdom of children and their innate sense of what is right and what is wrong. So we all have our influences, and it's really nice to be able to live by what you teach and what you teach your kids and what you value. And so I'm proud to live by those values and try to instill those at United Neuroscience. So, at UNS, our mission is really, we want to deliver safe and effective treatments to people. But it is also a core tenet that we have to deliver them so that they're accessible to everyone that needs them. Because at the end of the day, diseases like Alzheimer's, they do not discriminate. They don't care how much you make, where you live, what you do for a living. And because they don't, neither should medicine. Thank you.